Sorry. The play has a nearly naked quality. Young Jean Lee's ideas are so keenly important. It's like they ran out of a burning house in just their underwear. This is a quote from Jesse Green, who reviewed the play Straight White Men for Vulture.com in 2014. And I chose this play to start with because it's a good one that emphasizes young Jean Lee's attention to the ideas of the play. My goal today is to share with you some of the themes of the play and then to engage you in a dialogue for the play based upon those themes. To prepare for the play, I read the play yet again so that it was very fresh in my mind. And then I also did some additional online research, this time concentrating on trying to find sources such as reviews and interviews and articles that focused on themes. Now there's always a lot of themes in any play that you read, and Straight White Men is no exception. I'd like to concentrate today on three particular themes: privilege, identity, and the pressure to live up to expectations. I'll start with the idea of privilege because it's one of the things that we find almost immediately in the play when the characters of Jake and Drew begin to play that version of Monopoly called privilege that their mother made for them. It's also a theme that almost every single review that I read began to talk about. Natalie Sachs, in a 2014 review of the play from Charged.fm, said this: "So, what is the value of a straight white man in a privilege-conscious world, when every goal he achieves comes at the expense of someone less fortunate who did not have the same opportunities?" Young Jean Lee poses this question throughout the play, leaving the conundrum open for the audiences to consider it long after it ends. I like this quote because it acknowledges that as readers and viewers, we bring a sense of how privilege works in the world, and we view the play partially through that lens. Deborah Vankin, in a 2015 article from the New York Times, said this about what she viewed as the central question posed by the play: how can these four individuals lead a moral life given the privilege they share as straight white men? She then goes on to quote young Jean Lee herself, who states, "It's the question of what do we want privileged straight white men to do that they're not doing? And what happens when they do that? What do we want people to do? What are our values in a society?" And I think that's what the play ended up being about. I like these quotes because they specifically connected an awareness of privilege with the challenge of leading a moral life and impacting societal values, which for me are some of the central things that the play brings up. There's lots of examples about privilege embedded in the play. One prime one, as I mentioned, is this idea of the board game. And the character of Ed describes this as one of your mother's craftiest inventions. How else are you going to learn not to be assholes? Later in the play, Jake accuses his father of teaching them to obsess over privilege, to which Ed then counters, "We taught you to appreciate what you had. Do some good with it, not just sit around talking about it for the sake of talking." I like these quotes because they're examples of how young Jean Lee specifically foregrounds and utilizes the idea of privilege as a theme in the dialogue. So having thought just a little bit about some of these examples, here's a question that we might ponder for our dialogue later on. In what ways do the characters demonstrate an awareness of privilege and act upon that awareness? So, having thought a little about the theme of privilege, I'd like to go on to the theme of identity. Bess Rowan, in 2014, in her review of the play in HuffingtonPost.com, said this: "These four white, straight, male, liberal American characters are shown to be trying their best to navigate the world as best they can. The characters on stage aren't there to be hated, or to be belittled, or to be blamed for the world's problems, but nor are they to be pitied. Instead, these individuals force us to ask a critical question. What's the best way to handle that identity in the world today? I like that quote because it, again, foregrounds the idea of identity and does the sort of work in terms of posing a question for the audience to consider. Emphasizes the idea of theme. Young Jean Lee has also talked about the idea of identity in several interviews. In a 2014 interview with Carly Maga for The Guardian, she said this: "I feel like suddenly there's so much stuff in the media about straightness, whiteness, and maleness. It hasn't been examined to the same extent that other identities have been. Plenty of people I've spoken to have never been confronted with having to think about themselves as a group of people with a label. I think maybe things are changing, but maybe not as much as we think." I like this quote because it's young Jean Lee specifically putting it intentional that this exploration of the theme of identity is something that she's going to foreground. And again, asks that question for the audience to ponder about how it's perceived if you have that identity as a straight white male. There are many examples of this in the play as well. Ed, for example, talks directly about how his identity as a man was shaped. "When I was growing up, everyone got married and stayed married. It was just what you did. I didn't grow up with a sense that I had any options." It's a small example, but it's one example how the characters in the play, and each one of them do, talk about the idea of identity. So, having thought about these, here's a second question that we might ponder for our dialogue. Why do you think straight white male identity hasn't been examined as much as other identities? And how does the play begin to provide that kind of an examination? So, having thought about the ideas of privilege and identity as themes, I'd like to move on to the third one, which is this pressure to live up to expectations. And I think we see this within the play, specifically with the character of Matt. Charles Isherwood in the New York Times, 2014, said this: "Ms. Lee wants us to sympathize with the inexpressible anguish of her protagonist, a middle-aged, upper-middle-class, straight white man named Matt who has failed to follow the codes of achievement that he's expected to conform to. Matt will only say that he's just trying to be useful, but he hasn't figured out how, or if it's even possible." I like this quote because it emphasizes the idea of the pressure to live up to expectations and the possible consequences for failure to do so. As you might imagine, young Jean Lee has also spoken about this particular theme. And this came out of a story that she was telling in a 2014 interview for NPR with the reporter Neda Ulabi. In the story, she talked about gathering a group of women, LGBTQIA+ people, and people of color together in a room and asking them specifically the question about, well, how would you like straight white men to behave and act? What, in your ideal world, would this be? I mean, they had lots of answers. She wrote them all down, and she actually used those answers to construct the character of Matt. Then, interestingly, she took some scenes with the character of Matt back to that same group for additional feedback. They hated him. And young Jean Lee said, "I realized the reason why they hated him, despite all of their commitment to social justice, was that what they believed in most was not being a loser, i.e. not living up to your potential." I like this quote because it strongly emphasizes how central this idea of being self-actualized and living up to potential really does circulate within our culture. There's lots of examples again from the play. Here's one. It seems like the character of Ed has a lot of these. And he says, in the first act, he refers to Matt as a prodigy. He notes that he was always trying to save the world, and then later calls him the best of the best. All of these suggesting potential. And then in that fake interview, he said this: "I see from your resume that you have a lifelong commitment to social justice. With your background and all these references, Why haven't you done anything meaningful? Lays it right out there about potential. It seems like all the characters in the play are having difficulty understanding Matt's situation, and one of the things they fall back on is this idea of not living up to expectations or the potential. So, a third question for our dialogue might be this. Do you think Matt is consciously or unconsciously choosing not to fulfill the expectations his family had for him, and why? So you've heard about three things: privilege, identity, and living up to expectations. At this point, I would like to invite you to participate in a dialogue about these themes. We'll go back to the questions that I posed.
Do we film this? Yeah. Cool. Okay.
Question number one, about the idea of privilege. What do you think? In what ways do the characters demonstrate an awareness of privilege and then act upon that awareness in the course of the play? What are some of your ideas?
I kind of mentioned this like in one of the last classes we had. I don't know if it was last week or whatever, but how she would just add like really little stuff. Like I talked about like the thermostat thing, and how like people who are more privileged don't look at stuff like that, like how much it really costs to have like heating or cooling in their house. It costs a lot of money for some people, and so like some people won't turn on their AC in the summer because it's too expensive. And so like I think it's, what's his name? Jake. I think he's like, Dad, turn on the dang thermostat, it's freezing in here, something like that. It's like, it's only costs like, what, $20 more a month, which is like so much for some people. But he's realizing that it's really nothing to them, and that he can just turn on the thermostat whenever he wants. It's just like little stuff like that we don't really think about. So.
I was going to say another one of the little things is like ordering Chinese food and having it delivered and all that stuff. Sometimes that gets expensive, having it delivered and ordered, especially on like a holiday.
And it's just kind of complicated. They're not even thinking about that really in terms of privilege, nor are they thinking about thermostat in terms of privilege.
Kind of also thinking about the Chinese food subject. Most places that I can think of, if it's an actual like Chinese restaurant, it's a Chinese family that'll like make it and deliver it. And it is still a holiday, and whether they're Christian or not, they still might be celebrating. So making them like work and deliver to them on a global holiday like that is a little rude.
Right, and thinks about not being thinking about privilege. Yeah.
Kind of going off what Bo said, I don't remember, it was like the bagel thing, when they were looking for bagels, and like this certain store didn't have it, and it was a holiday, and they were like super pissed off about it. And it's like, dude, like, yeah, they were like super upset that the store didn't have bagels on Christmas or the day after Christmas. I don't remember exactly what day it was, but it's like, other people have things to do. Like, it's just that, yeah, kind of going off that, like, you're expecting other people to work on a holiday even though, like, you're not.
Yeah, those have been really good examples where they seem to not be thinking about privilege, right? Can you think of some that are examples where they actually are thinking about privilege? Some more. Yeah, Keith.
I think it was Ed when he was talking about like his career and his job, and he was talking about how he knows that he like makes comments about race and gender and like pokes fun at people like that, and he knows it's a thing he does. But
And that's interesting. It's the character of Jake. He knows that
He only hires white girls.
he understands the idea of privilege. He articulates it, and then essentially says, "I'm still not acting upon that and trying to make things better." Right? What else? Any other examples? It's embedded on the road throughout, and actually the character of Drew has said some things about how he learned how to this is the idea of identity, and hopefully you have some thoughts about this. Why do you think that straight white male identity hasn't been examined as much as other identities? That's the key question. And then does the play help to address that? Anna, you had your hand up.
I think it's just because it's been the common thing for so long, and then now we're focusing more on minorities because they're the new thing, I guess. It's the best way to describe it, because we're not as used to it, and we're still learning to deal with it, and we've just known the straight standard for a long, long time.
That idea of standard and attention being given to other identities. That's a good point. Paloma, do you want to add in with that?
No, I was just gonna say the same thing.
All right, well,
I would kind of say that like the straight white men have kind of ruled the world for basically the whole world, and that so we've never had to question its validity and its identity. But now that there are all these other people who are emerging and saying, "Hey, I want to be recognized too," then they're being scrutinized and it's like to just kind of see if it can live up to the standard of being like the straight white man to see it. Because like there are people who are like, that's not real. That's not something that I think is real. So we've never had to say that about being a straight white man.
and so just thinking about it and addressing it, it begins to call it into question and think about what is that identity?
Mhm.
No, it's a good point. Lisa?
I was like, to kind of go along with that, I think, when we hear the word privilege, we never really, it's not a negative word. So to say that like a straight white man is a privileged race and a privileged gender, we don't see them as, we're like, oh, their lives are great. They never have to go through, like, I'm over exaggerating, but like they
Right.
never have to go through anything. Their lives are so great. And like when we hear the word homosexual or transsexual, we're like, oh, they must have gone through so much. Their lives must be horrible. Like I wonder, they must be like having a really hard time. And so I think like the connotation between the words, like really, like it's not something to think about, I guess.
That's a really, really good point, especially when you think about connotation and comparison. Betsy,
I think our society also has a tendency to believe that if we don't talk about something, it'll just go away. It'll just take care of itself. I think of it a lot in terms of race, and like you don't want to be racist, so you avoid the question altogether. And so I think that's a big case of privilege as well, because when privilege comes up, I think a lot of us, being white, have some hard questions to answer and some difficult things to think about. And so yeah, I think it's great that a play is choosing to address some of those issues.
yeah. And we might think about how it's seems like that's Young Jean Lee's goal. This hasn't been foregrounded. I'm going to. How does she do it? Yeah.
I think one of the ways she does that is by showing us that while these men are incredibly privileged, like they're like the peak of what we would consider like a privileged person, they still do have their struggles. It's not like because they have everything handed to them that they have such a perfect life. Is like, especially in Matt, because he has everything set up for him to be great. He's very smart. He's in this privileged class and gender and sexuality, but he still is failing. So it's kind of humanizing them in a way, and so somebody who's more attacking of people who have this privilege can see that they're also people.
I think that's really good. And it comes back to one of the purpose, which is the idea that it's not to punish this person, it's not to blame this person, it's to just ask the question about what does it mean to have that identity. And it seems like she does that, foregrounds that by naming the play what she does, and then having all of the characters in the play become part of that category or class of identity. She can push that to the foreground and make us aware of that. Go on.
I think it was either Jake or Drew who like had a divorce,
Yeah.
and that's like another thing that goes up with what I was saying. Like even though maybe their lives are easier because they're privileged or whatever, not necessarily in the same ways though. Like maybe there's other things going on. And I also feel like going back to like the racial jokes and stuff that they make throughout the show, that might be like masking something, like masking their own like problems and say, okay, let's just make them someone else, kind of like normal people in real life, you know.
And especially when we think about the character of Jake, who we find out has been married to an African American woman and has biracial children, and yet still, in terms of identity, is able to make that disconnect and do the racist jokes, etc.
Yeah, he's probably tried to distance himself. And then also, I think that it probably also worked really well that she wrote it, and she's not a white male straight guy. So that was cool because it showed that it wasn't like her own like opinion kind of thing, and it wasn't like from her own point of view. It's like, hey, I'm an outsider too, but look at this. That's kind of cool.
And one of the things that she says is, and she said in some interviews, I was surprised at how many connections I was actually able to make with these characters. And she says that that's actually one of the dynamics of the play when the play is done, is that people in the audience, despite what their identities are able to forge connections with that fits.
Yeah.
Let's see, you had something.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to put this. But something that struck me a little bit, and I don't pretend to be a minority or like understand what it's like to come from that viewpoint, but just kind of thinking about the other side, like I don't know if I was, say, racially or sexually more of a minority, how I would feel about this play, because it's kind of like throughout, it's like the characters are kind of feeling bad for Matt, and then they're angry at Matt, and honestly, my personal interpretation of Matt was he's just kind of a miserable character. Like, he didn't do much for himself or anything, and so I wonder how minorities really feel about that. It's just like, why are we feeling bad for this man? You know, like, his life isn't the greatest, but he still has so much if he takes advantage of it. And so, I don't know.
It's a really great point, and I think that actually ties back to that one of those quotes that she had when she did that focus group interview, and the people that she asked, and then looked at the character that she tried to create, hated that character.
I don't like him either.
Hated that character, and yet it seems that young Jin Lee is trying to create a complex response to that character,
Right.
and maybe pull you toward him, and then kind of push you away from him at the same time. That's kind of what I did wonder.
When I was reading the show, the character of Matt reminded me of, I can't remember, I think it's Karen from August Osage County, the younger sister who's staying to take care of the mom and dad.
Yeah, Ivy.
Yes, Ivy. It's Ivy. And the whole time you want to feel bad for her, but you really can't because she did it to herself.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I felt about Matt. Is he has all these tools to like do something about it. He just hasn't. So that's why it was a little bit infuriating.
Yeah.
Good. Great job, Laura.
I was just gonna say, going off of what they both said, to me it's kind of complicated because Matt like doesn't take advantage of the situations. We hate him. If he would have, we probably still would have hated him. Like, you know, and I feel like, again, like, I don't know how to phrase it. Not that people who are privileged are just wrong no matter what, but I do feel like that is kind of where we get into a complication, is it's like, I'm like straight and white, and whenever a dispute comes up about any racial issue or like sexual orientation, you know, I kind of like sit in my chair and like I'm just not gonna say anything because no matter what I say, I'm gonna, you know, and I feel like that's a problem, just in general, which I think could just add on to the story too. Is it's like, well, no one likes Matt, but no one likes the other characters either.
No, that's a really great observation. Jake even starts to address that a little bit in the play. He says, I see us being in a position, straight women, being in a position that we can't win. No matter what we do, no one's wishing for our success, right? I'm gonna pull Alex in here.
Something to kind of play off of that too that I thought was interesting was, I think is either Young Julie or someone, I don't know, at the beginning of the play, like before the play actually starts, they have all this like information for it. They kind of touch on that too, how they're like, it's just like, in our society, it's almost like assumed that like if a minority of any sort tries to get ahead, that like, it's just assumed that it's for good, you know, like, oh, good for them. But then like if a straight white guy does it, it's almost just assume that, how dare them, you know? And it's just interesting that they kind of touched on that, like in the beginning of that too.
I think you're absolutely right. And Young Jean Lee has talked about that as well. You're absolutely right.
I was just gonna say that I think that the timing of this play is very interesting because I think that the term privileged has become a very negative word. I think that when someone says like, "Oh, you're very privileged," that's very negative to say that to somebody. Like, because it's like, you're never like, "Oh, you're so privileged," like, "Oh, you're so cute," like, or like, you know, like it's a very negative thing to say to somebody because it doesn't say, "Oh, you're hardworking," or "You're determined," or "You're talented." It's, "Oh, you're privileged. This was handed to you," and I think that is something that is very like stifling to someone who actually is talented and hardworking and intelligent, like Matt was. And I think that that's something that could be to be told your whole life, like you're privileged. That's basically become a synonym to you've had everything handed to you. And so it's like, well, then okay, like I think that that's a very interesting thing that happened to Matt because I think that that's not that uncommon anymore.
That's a really good point. And I like the way that you're thinking about the connotative meaning that's been put on this idea, or even just the word privilege, and how we respond when we do that. It ties back, I think, a little bit even to the quote that is said about being in a privileged, conscious world. We bring to the table an awareness of the thought of privilege as we take a look at this play, and it becomes foregrounded as a part of the play. We connect with it and bring that to the table. Connor?
Just adding on to that, if anyone watches South Park last season, there was a whole thing called the PC frat, which was the privilege check frat, and they would keep going around and going, check your privilege. And it just added to the connotation that privilege used to be like, oh, this was passed down or this was earned, but it changed into, oh, you were given this, so now you feel self-entitled and self-important, and now you have to impose it upon everybody else, so you need to back off and just become non-existent.
Great point. And I like that analogy. I haven't seen that episode. That would be good to take a look at. I'm going to pull on my, we'll take pull on this question and there are comments.
This might go into the third
Yeah.
one. Okay.
Yeah.
Going off of like what Dana said, didn't they say in there that Matt like went to Harvard or something? That wasn't like a joke. Like he actually did that, right? Okay, so like I'm pretty sure even if you go to Harvard, you still have to have like good grades and stuff. And he obviously graduated, so he is hardworking. It sounds like, or at least he was once upon a time, and like because he graduated all these different places and did all this stuff, but then he kind of just stopped. So it's like he grew up knowing he was privileged, but then he still worked hard and did the right things. But then he got to a point of his life where he's like acknowledging the people around him and like society. And he's probably like, well, I did do this, but no matter what I say to people, they're just going to see me as privileged, not as hardworking. Because I did go to Harvard, and there's so many people who can't go there. Even though I succeeded when I went there, it doesn't matter because I went there. You know what I mean? So that's kind of interesting to think about.
I think it's actually a really, really great point, and I'm actually really glad that you bring that up because I think it does lead to this last question.
Yeah.
Is Matt, is the character of Matt, consciously or unconsciously choosing not to live up to his expectations or the potential? And why? What's your thought on this? Is this a conscious choice that he's making? Or is this something deeper and unconscious that's driving him as well?
I think, kind of just going off of what I just said, it's kind of both, where it's like he's conscious in the way that he knows that like he knows how society is kind of thing, and like where he's like placed in everybody's mind, you know, how they see him, but then he's unconsciously just not allowing himself to like do anything. That's why he's just kind of like, I think that's why he keeps crying, because he's like so like in his head all the time that he doesn't know how to like do anything with his life because he's so worried about what other people think of him maybe, and he should just do what he wants. And what his brothers and his dad are saying, like, hey, you actually have the opportunity to make a difference. The rest of us are already successful, but our jobs are like average jobs, you know. but he could do whatever he wanted because he has all these successes, but he's reached the point where he's like, but if I go any further, make more people mad at me. So that's kind of weird. It's a weird position to be in. I think it's both.
It really is, and you find that within the character where he's at.
Yeah.
And I think you were next.
I agree that it's both, but I think it's a little bit more unconscious because from like the society he grew up in, he was constantly told, you're going to do great things, you're going to be successful, you're going to be great. And then I think he got out into the world and kept hearing the privileged, you're privileged thing, and it like, he didn't think it affected him, but it did unconsciously. It's kind of like the kid that never wins. The first time they lose, they like have mental breakdown. And I don't know, I just think it's kind of that.
Really good point.
Yeah.
I think your logic and the way you thought about it makes a lot of sense. We'll go to Connor. Oh, Lisa, yeah.
I also think it's a bit of both, and I think it's also something else too. But on the sense of it's both, I think it's both in the sense that he grew up in this household which, while it was privileged, it was well known that he was privileged. But he also grew up in a environment where he was taught certain things aren't that. Certain households are taught that showing emotion is frowned upon. Obviously, I think that he grew up in the family environment that gave credibility to showing emotions, which explains a lot about his dynamic as a character. But also, getting on to that other thing, he's a man, and so he has pride, and that's why he doesn't take check from his father, even though he's not actively doing anything with his life. He still has the mentality of, no, I've been given everything, I need to do something for myself.
Excellent. Well,
I think it's more in his head, like that he's kind of doing it to himself, because he has been growing, like his whole life he has been aware of the privilege that he has, and I think he's letting it affect him too negatively. The ideal is for someone who has all these privileges and all these things that were given to them to take that and use it in a way that can help more people, because you can still have this privilege and still use it in a way that is good for everybody. I just saw this story somewhere online where, because of all the recent events that have been happening with people being shot and killed for absolutely no reason, this person of color was pulled over, and there's this whole Twitter monologue that they posted that a white woman stopped and stood there the whole time while the entire interaction happened between this person of color who'd been pulled over and a cop, just to make sure nothing bad happened. That was as an example of somebody who has this white privilege of like, they know nothing's going to happen while they're there, using it to help someone else. So instead of kind of forcing himself into this like pity party where he's like, I can't do anything because I'm going to be frowned upon if I do anything right, he takes it a little too far.
I think you use a really good example of how the idea of the privilege can be It's great. But Lisa, we'll end with you.
Sure. It's short. I was just gonna say that I would definitely agree with everyone else that it's a mix of both. I don't think you can clearly say that it's either or, but I think I would definitely go to say that it's more conscious than unconscious, just for the fact that when they're doing the ridiculous mock interview thing, that I think that it's Jake that's just like, come on, you can do it, just do it. And then Matt, he's like, I know, but I can't. And so I think that in itself says that he's making the conscious choice. He's like, oh, I know that I can be more than I am, but like, I can't. And usually when we say we can't, we actually can, but we're making the conscious choice not to.
Good.
So
I think that's a really, really good point, and you found very good examples to back up that reasoning. Well, I want to thank you very much for participating in the class dialogue today. My goal today was to talk a little bit with you about the themes of the play Straight White Men, and then to engage you in a dialogue about those themes. The themes we talked about were privilege, identity, and this idea of living up to your expectations. What I hope to have you take away from this is thinking about how those ideas of privilege, identity, and expectations intersect not only in the play, would say there's nothing you can do to erase the problem of your own existence. She would tell me not to despair and to keep trying to find my way. Thank you.
Yeah.